Welcome to ENG 328, Study Session 10, South African Poetry, Dennis Brutus, Introduction. In this study session, we will examine the contributions of Dennis Brutus, who was born in Salisbury, Southern Rhodesia, now Harare, Zimbabwe, of South African parents in November 1924. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to outline the condition of black people in South Africa during the apartheid regime. Examine the response of Dennis Brutus to the apartheid regime through his work. Short biography of Dennis Brutus. Dennis Brutus was born in Salisbury, Southern Rhodesia, now Harare, Zimbabwe, of South African parents on 28 November 1924. Educated South Africa at Fort Hare University College in Alice and the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He taught English for 14 years in South African high schools. A colored person, Brutus participated in many anti-apartheid campaigns, particularly those concerned with sports. Eventually, the South African government banned him from attending political and social meetings and made it illegal for any his writings to be published in South Africa. In this study session, you will learn about his works. Apartheid in South Africa. All our land is scarred with terror, rewarded unlovely and unlovable. Sundered are we and all our passionate surrender, but somehow tenderness survives. Dennis Brutus, Somehow We Survive. The modern African poets who wrote about colonialism were preoccupied with a past problem. Their work, like yam shoots, flowered out of the corpse of colonialism, though its ghost is still living among Africans. Contrary to this, the South African poets have painted and are painting from life. Their model, apartheid, is before them and very much alive in all its ugly aspects, brutalizing the poets as they write and demonstrate various antics towards that enemy. Hydra-headed beast, apartheid, which more than its mentor, colonialism, has terrorized and dehumanized the black South Africans. Mubelto Visikungo Muzanin graphically captures the nature of racial discrimination in Brutus' Apartheid South Africa in the following words. You are born to parents who have had to beat the influx, control regulations in order to live together and mate. Your locations, which have been divided along racial lines in accordance with the Group Area Act, you are taught, based very often by teachers who really know no better, under the Bantu education system. At university, you are taught by third-rate lecturers who have failed to make the grade at Stellenbosch or Pretoria and have therefore been relegated to teaching blacks. When you complete, you may not do certain category of job, even if you are qualified for it because of the Job Reservation Act. Here is the same type of contradiction that in history has tended to present despotism as benevolence, the same type of hypocrisy that represented colonial oppression and exploitation in the guise of civilization and salvation. According to R.E. Simmons, 3 centuries of white settlement is faced by colonial wars, expropriations of tribal lands, slavery, forced labor, and industrialism. Color prejudice was endemic and deeply ingrained among whites, but their policy of racial discrimination, through vicious and degrading, differed in degree rather than in kind from the discrimination practiced elsewhere under colonial rule. 1967 Ditto 7. Apartheid or aparthood is therefore the high water mark of the colonial movement, comprehending in one breath oppression, discrimination, exploitation, enslavement, and estrangement. In South Africa, strangers have become landlords, as it were, and forced the owners of the land into cultural and physical exile. According to Egudu, it is this hostile situation that constitutes the background of modern South African poetry. This poetry is prefaced with the struggles and agitations of earlier freedom fighters, such as the League of African Rights, formed in August 1929, 1976 Ditto 46. Their freedom song, like modern South African poetry, is both an expose and a reaction. We, the black race, cry for freedom. Africa, our motherland, was taken from our fathers when the darkness hemmed them around. As a result of the inspirations from the above song, the South African poets have responded to the apartheid situation in various ways. According to Egudu, a number of the poets have merely sung their sorrows, and their poetry reads like a weak, limbered dirge. Author Noje, 1970, for example, is mainly concerned with self-pity resulting from loneliness in exile and general racial discrimination. His poetry is therefore sentimental and tends to sap the energy from action. The poetry of Dennis Brutus. In examining the work of Dennis Brutus, there has been 5 distinct phases in his development as a poet, each marked by formal and thematic shifts that not only reflect his changing preoccupations and professional concerns, but also document profound transformation in his conception of the nature and function of poetry. Each new phase has grown out of a personal experience that made him question his previous attitudes towards verbal art and seek a more satisfying outlet for his energies of articulation. His collections include A Simple Lust, 1973, Sirens, Knuckles and Boots, 1963, was published in Nigeria through the assistance of his friends while he was in a South African prison. From prison, he used to smuggle out series of poems to his wife, writing about his prison experiences. Those were later published as Letters to Martha, 1968. His later collections include China Poems, 1975, Stubborn Hope, 1978, Salute and Censures, 1982, and Heirs and Tributes, 1989. Brutus reacts with vigor, integrity, and defiant hopefulness to the apartheid police regime in South Africa. It is Brutus' temper, intellect, and imagination that saved the protest from sounding merely strident, from degenerating into blubbering emotionalism or mawkish self-pity or naive malice. Brutus has demonstrated through his poetry that he is fully aware of and responsive to the brutal world of South Africa. In the words of Egudu, Brutus is fully alive to his social responsibility as a South African poet. He once said, "I think it is simply true that an artist, a writer, is a man who lives in a particular society and takes his images and ideas from that society." This is tantamount to saying that the nature and magnitude of a person's behavioral response, for example, what he says, thinks, or does, is some function of the stimulus situation in which he is placed and of the nature of his personality. Then his Brutus poetry is a reaction of one who is mental agony, whether he is at home or abroad. This agony is partly caused by harassments, arrests, and imprisonments, and mainly by Brutus' concern for other suffering people. This Brutus feels psychically injured in some of his poems, when he transverses all his land as a troubadour, finding wandering motion sweeter far than rest. He is feeling the pinch of restiveness resulting from dislodgement. All the factors that make life uncomfortable are assembled in the poem. Burning of inquiry and movement, Saracen arrests and the captor's hand, and against them Brutus takes to roaming in freedom, disdaining, quixoting, for example, pursuing an ideal, honor, and devotion. Singing all the time. His fight is purely psychological, not physical, for he puts up an attitude which the oppressors would least expect and which would disconcert them. Brutus is combating the forces of oppressions with a tenderness which, though it is frustrated, does not wither. SLP 4. As in the previous poem, the agent of pain here touched the mainstay of the mind. Perhaps a good place to begin would be with one of the first London poems, In a Simple Lust. I walk in the English quicksilver dusk, and spread my hands to the soft spring rain, and see the street lights gild the flowering trees, and the late light breaking through patches of broken cloud. And I think of the island's desolate dusks, and the swish of the island's haunting rain, and the desperate frenzy straining our prisoned breasts, and the men who are still there, crouching now in the grey cells, on the grey floors, stubborn and bowed. 1973, Ditto 102. The painful recollection of his imprisonment on Robben Island, the contrasts between freedom and confinement, the manifold sensory perceptions, all these are typical of Brutus' poetry in exile. But even more noteworthy is the full-bodied texture of the poem. Brutus is no longer writing on ornamented verse. The diction is simple. The form is irregular. The line length flexible instead of fixed, but there are also traces of alliteration, slaughtered end rhymes, dusk, dusks, breasts, rain, rains, cloud, now, bird. In the same poem, there are the investigating searchlights. There is the monolithic decalogue of fascist prohibition, and above all there are petrels which, like snakes, uncoil along the asphalt, dark, hissing their menace of our lives. These forces have organized the terror with which all our land is scarred, and which rendered it unlovely and unlovable. The fact that Brutus emphasizes his use of tenderness and not malice or even physical action as a fighting weapon does not mean that he is not appreciative of the ugliness of his situation. He clearly states in I Am the Exile, SLP 137, that although he is a gentle and calm and courteous to servility, yet wailings fill the chambers of my heart, and in my head, behind my quiet eyes, I hear the cries and sirens. And this goes on to emphasize the point that his pain is mental rather than physical. For this kind of pain, Brutus devises a mental weapon, as indicates in Off the Campus. So here, I crouch and knock my venomed aroused to pierce deaf eardrums waxed by fear, and from the corner of my eye catch glimpses of a glinting spear. In warfare, it is the nature of attack that determines the type of weapons to be employed by the attack for defense. In South Africa, it is not so much the physical destruction of the blacks and colored by the whites as the dehumanization that is painful to Brutus. At adulthood, his experience, which included deprivation of fundamental human rights through coercion and other pedagogies of apartheid system, incessant brutalization and harassment, was largely responsible for his perception of South African reality and the shaping of his critical sensibility. 1997 Ditto 180. It also informed his subsequent reactions, which are readily predictable. One can notice this in Mirror Sermon. This cold reflection of our interlocking nudity moralizes ascetically on sensual intellection or morality, a simple lust. 21. According to Da Silva, the cold raw, enshrouded or unflavored presentation of reality of man's humanity to man in apartheid, South Africa is suggestive of sheer ignorance of the fact that man, regardless of color or race, is born equal. Our interlocking nudity, the poet means as in love making or in death. One thing that man cannot help is being voluntarily naked. 1997 Ditto 180. The poet goes further to portray the macabre dance that is apartheid system while using love-making images in the following lines. Our images cavort in silent dissonance or graceless dance. Slow sarabands of passionless lasciviousness and lace through a cacophonous gavotte, marionettes devoid of graceful antecedents, we period in senseless choreography or jerk on twitching strings of lust. A simple lust. 21. Brutus' artistic and critical vision transcends the question of apartheid or racial problems, as expressed by him in their behavior. Their guilt is not so very different from our exercises. Who does not join in the arbitrary of power or grasp for himself what might have been another's, and who has not used superior force in the moment when he could, and who of us has not been tempted to these things? According to Da Silva, the point the poet seems to be making is the need for victims of apartheid not to see the issue of wickedness as a monopoly of the white. It is inherent in man regardless of color or race. 1997 Ditto 181. It could therefore be said that Brutus made a success of his poetic response to the apartheid situation in South Africa. His concern for the suffering of others, his intellectual protest without malice, and the hope which has defied despair, all of which he has portrayed through images and diction that are imbued with freshness and vision, show him to be a capable poet fully committed to his social responsibility. Study session summary. Throughout much of his career, the hallmark of Brutus' most mature poetry has been a consistently resonant lucidity couched in a variety of expressive forms. He has also remained a steadfast opponent of social injustice and political oppression, speaking out against the evils of apartheid and other institutionalized forms of racial discrimination. We have come to the end of study session 10. Thanks for listening.